So let me outline Freudian ego theory. Oh no, I'm drowning. Look, I'm underwater. No, it's okay. I'm okay. I can breathe. So understanding Freud's ego theory is integral to understanding and approaching dreams using his Freudian method of dream interpretation. So Freud proposed that the human psyche or personality could be divided into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And we can use the metaphor of an iceberg to better visualize this theory. At the conscious level, above the water, we have parts of the ego and superego. Those are near the tip of the iceberg and they're above the surface, so we can see these parts of ourselves and be aware of how they're working in everyday life. But the vast majority of what makes us who we are is the part of the iceberg that's hidden underwater and comprises not only parts of the ego and superego, but all of the id, which is completely below the surface of conscious awareness. So, the id is the completely unconscious, instinctive, animalistic, impulsive, childlike portion of the psyche that operates on the pleasure principle and seeks instant gratification and is the source of our basic impulses and drives to do certain things. The id is our lizard brain. It's the part of our brains which hasn't evolutionary changed much compared to what our cave people ancestors have. It's the part of the brain that's driven towards instinctual biological needs and satisfying those needs, such as food or procreation. We're all born with our id. It's innate. The id is a necessary part of our personality for biological evolutionary reasons, because as newborn babies who can't talk yet, it allows us to get our basic needs met, such as crying when we're hungry, or need to be burped, or changed, or repositioned, or feel scared, or upset, or uncomfortable. Basically, whenever babies feel they need the slightest thing, they will make it known immediately, regardless of the situation the baby is in, such as on a packed airplane, for example. You may have experienced that, or in a movie theater. Why is that baby in the movie theater? So babies don't care if there are strangers around them who may feel awkward that a baby is crying. The baby is just trying to satisfy the id directly, and the id wants whatever feels good at the time and doesn't care about the reality surrounding any situation we find ourselves in or about the needs of anyone else around us. The id only cares about satisfying itself. And even though we've grown past being babies, we still all have this lizard brain within us. Freud thinks that we've just repressed it and pushed it way down below the surface of conscious awareness and concealed it with the self-narratives and the social rules of the ego and the superego so we can function as civil adults in everyday life. But our id is still not only within us, but forms a large part of us and guides a lot of our drives for things, like I said, without us being aware of it. And we usually try to, again, provide a narrative, try to rationalize those drives and cover over them with logical explanations and provide a different socialized meaning for why we're experiencing them. For example, as a human, I get hungry. Sometimes I'm hungry to the point where it's uncomfortable, but I go about addressing my need for food in quiet and civilized ways. I don't just start crying about it and bawling out loud until someone runs to get me food. Except for that one time at the food court, but the line for Taco Hut was really long. So the ego represses the desires of the id and pushes them down into the subconscious or the unconscious, where it's out of sight and out of mind, literally, and out of our awareness. But while it's buried there, deep down, they continue to impact us in dramatic ways, according to Freud. So another example is that a lot of people like nice, fast, expensive luxury cars. There's a whole car culture out there. They have a drive, no pun intended, for reading car magazines and going to car shows. And they tell themselves stories of why, to rationalize why they like and pursue fancy cars, such as, oh, I appreciate the engineering, or I'm just a fan of racing sports. But underlying these socially constructed and indirect reasons are the more basic, id driven, lizard brain's direct desires for things like power and strength and excitement and control and attention and attracting members of the desired sex and procreation and furthering the species and passing your genetics on, all of which fancy sports cars indirectly represent. So we may give ourselves all sorts of rational reasons for liking cars, but underneath that is the cave people id drive of, ooh, me like fast things, me want to attract members of the desired sex, therefore fancy cars good. So most of what drives us in everyday life towards doing certain things and acting certain ways and pursuing certain decisions, most of these underlying drives and impulses and feelings and emotions are buried deep within that inaccessible depths of our unconscious. And only a small amount of what defines our personalities and what we know about ourselves actually belongs to our conscious awareness. Most of it is below the iceberg, or rather, it's the large chunk of the iceberg below the surface of the water, which forms most of the iceberg, but we only see the tip. So, as we grow up and interact more and more with the world around us and its discourses and social rules, the second part of the personality begins to develop. And Freud called this part the ego, the part that we can see and be consciously aware of, at least most of it, like I said. Instead of operating purely based on the pleasure principle, like the id, the ego is based on the reality principle. The ego understands that other people around us have needs and desires, and that sometimes being impulsive and selfish on our behalf can hurt us in the long run. So we consciously restrain ourselves and consider others and develop empathy as a protective mechanism in our social lives. It's the ego's job to meet the needs of the id, so feed it and clothe it and shelter it, while taking into consideration the reality of the situation and repressing a lot of our baser impulses, which would not be considered socially acceptable if we pursued them in a wild and unrestrained manner. Freud compared the relationship between the ego and the id to that between a chariot rider and their horses. So the horses are the id. They provide the energy and the drive, while the chariot rider is the ego who harnesses the id and reins it in and provides direction for it to use the id in ways that are productive instead of destructive. And then the third part of our personality is the superego, which is the purely moral component of the psyche, which takes into account what we each as individuals believe is the morally right thing to do in a given situation. So you could equate the superego to the conscience, in that it dictates our belief of right and wrong and serves as the moral arbiter or the internal moral governor for our actions, as a kind of guiding conscience regarding pursuing the things that are seen as moral and avoiding the things considered immoral. And those standards of morality that we hold ourselves to are not inherent to us, but are socially constructed and instilled in us as we grow up, and it forms the superego. So our cave people ancestors, who were only operating on their lizard brains, certainly did not hold themselves to any standards of morality at the time, and didn't even have a word for that concept. So in summary, the id is the realm of pure instinct, and the ego it's like a membrane over the id that harnesses it and controls it, but isn't driven by instinct in the same way the id is. And the superego is that governing force watching over the ego, making sure it doesn't succumb to the temptations of the id. So there are power relations at play even within ourselves and between different levels of our conscious and unconscious self. In a healthy person, according to Freud, the ego is the strongest of the three so that it can satisfy the needs of the id and not upset the superego and still take into consideration the reality of every situation. It's not an easy job for the ego. We're constantly restraining that unconscious aspects of ourselves. But if the id ever does get too strong, then impulses and self-gratification can take over a person's life, and it can lead to things like drug addiction or murder or other terrible violations of other people's rights or self-destructive tendencies. But on the other hand, the superego can't get too strong either, because if that equally impractical moralism of the superego becomes too strong, then the person will be driven by overly rigid morals and would be very judgmental and unbending in their interactions with the world. So a delicate balance must be struck between the two opposites, as if the id and the superego are two ends of a teeter-totter, and the ego is that part in the middle that is constantly vigilant to make sure one doesn't overpower the other. So we operate on roughly two levels of being all the time, conscious and unconscious. And these two levels can affect each other and influence each other. Our conscious mind can affect our subconscious or our unconscious through things like deliberate repetition, where certain mantras or actions are drilled until they become automatic habits. So let's say you're trying to fix your posture. You're making a conscious attempt to fix it. You might tell yourself throughout the day and remind yourself like, oh, fix your posture, stand up straight, shoulders back. And it's like this mantra that you repeat to yourself and remind yourself throughout the day to kind of cue you into the right posture. And then over time, this thing that you're consciously trying to drill into yourself becomes unconscious. And then you're just naturally and automatically having a good posture without having to consciously remind yourself. Or like various cognitive behavioral techniques for things like quitting smoking. Like again, like a mantra you can repeat to yourself, like, I don't need that, I'm strong without smoking. And just every time you feel that unconscious urge, you can curb it and tame it until the unconscious, learns its lesson and, is retrained by your conscious to not have that urge to begin with. But inversely, our unconscious can affect our conscious mind through things like dreams, which is the way our unconscious communicates with our conscious and makes it known, and Freudian slips, among others. So a Freudian slip is an error in speech or memory or physical action that occurs due to the emergence and interference of a repressed urge or desire into one's conscious train of thought. So it's when the unconscious just butts in and interferes with our conscious thoughts and actions. So classical examples involve slips of the tongue, where let's say you accidentally call your teacher mom, which is mortifying, and I feel for you if you've ever accidentally done that. I've come close sometimes in elementary school. But it's also understandable because both of those figures are like parental type authority figures, and you may unconsciously associate your teacher with your mom, and then it may just slip out in a Freudian slip. Or you're talking to your dad on the phone and you accidentally call them babe or baby. You're saying goodbye to your dad and you're just like, love you, babe. And you're just like, oh gosh, did I say that? But then after you're finished cringing, you can, again, reasonably see how a lot of us unconsciously associate our closest family members with our, people who are also close in our life, such as romantic partners. So it's not just slips of the tongue, it's not just errors in speech. Like I said, it could also be an error in your physical actions, like going in to give your teacher a hug because, again, you subconsciously associate them with a parent. Or you may mishear something, so it could be a slip of the ears in that case, where you're just unconsciously, you want to hear something, and then your hearing will have like a lapse in judgment and you'll think you'll hear that thing. Or mistyping, like sometimes you're typing something and you accidentally, just in the free flow of your fingers, that flow of consciousness, all of a sudden you type out a word that you did not mean to. So these are all cases of the unconscious emerging and erupting into our conscious actions and thoughts. So there's a gap, like you consider it like a gap of gray fog between your conscious and your unconscious. And you can sometimes catch glimpses of your unconscious instincts as they make their way through the fog into conscious thinking. And the conscious is largely unaware of what happens in the unconscious and generally disapproving of the little it does know about. Again, the unconscious doesn't abide by any rules of social acceptability or morality. And finally, on this image, you will see a middle part just underneath the water, between the conscious above the water and the unconscious. And the middle part is called the pre-conscious. This is the part of us that we can access when prompted, but it's not in our active conscious. So it's right below the surface, but still buried somewhat unless we search for it. So information such as the math formulas we learned growing up, or our telephone number, or our friends' numbers, or our family members' numbers, or maybe some childhood memories, or the steps for performing CPR. All of this stuff is stored in the pre-conscious, and we can retrieve it by thinking back and recalling from that store of memory that's just under the surface of conscious awareness, from which we can grab this information when it's of use to us or when it's triggered by external stimuli. Because it would be annoying if your friend's phone number or the steps for performing CPR was just constantly circulating in your conscious thoughts. So the preconscious is a way of storing those pieces of information and putting them on the shelf so that it's out of the way, but there if you need it.